Welcome to another episode of our AZ-500 study series. This is still part of the Manage Azure Active Directory Identities. In this episode, we will be learning about implementing hybrid identity. What are those? How do we configure authentication methods? And also we will be discussing what are those authentication methods. The two main ones are password hash synchronization and the pass-through authentication or PTA. After this theory, we will be doing this practice in our Azure lab. We will be configuring and deploying Azure AD Connect, configuring these two main authentication methods that we can implement with a hybrid identity. And also, we will be discussing and practicing these optimal authentication methods based on our current security posture. And lastly, the deployment of password write back. So now let's move to our next slide. So firstly, we should know what a hybrid identity is. So basically, hybrid identity is the process of connecting your on-premises Active Directory with your Azure AD directory to enable a single account to have access to resources on-premise and in the cloud. So it's more like like process of connecting your on-premise AD. Oh, I spelled that wrong. So to your Azure AD. That's the chain icon, by the way, for connection. So by doing this, you will be providing a common identity for your users, mainly on both Azure AD and your on-premise AD. So according to Microsoft, one of the benefits of having a hybrid identity is that it increases productivity of your users by giving them this common identity to access your on-premise AD and Azure AD resources or cloud resources. Let's say that, cloud resource. Alright, so to make this possible, we have to deploy Azure AD Connect. Let's define Azure AD Connect first. So Azure AD Connect, it integrates on-premise AD to Azure Active Directory. So the keyword there is integrate. Yes, so you may get a question, what integrates Azure AD and on-premise AD to provide common identity? That would be Azure AD Connect. It's actually a software, or I don't know how you call it. It's something that you install in a server or in the domain controller itself, so that it'll facilitate of all of this synchronization that will happen between your on-prem AD and Azure AD. So once you have this common identity, your users can use that benefit for accessing Microsoft 365, Azure, and your web applications that uses Azure AD as your identity provider. So Azure AD Connect, it provides benefits, or we call these features. The first thing we do is its main role, actually its main purpose is identity synchronization. So it's responsible for creating users, groups, and other objects, such as devices, as well as making sure identity information for your on-premises users and groups is matching the information in the cloud. So it actually, say if I, let's say this is your on-premise AD. Within that you have these informations of your users, groups, and devices, let's say, and you have this. You have your Azure AD here. So what will the AD Connect will do? It will facilitate the synchronization of all of these informations to Azure AD. What something you have to know here is, so let's say if a user identity or account was synchronized from or is being synchronized from on-premise AD to Azure AD, you will not be able to make changes in the Azure AD side. So if you want to change, let's say, the display name or the username, you have to do it within the on-premise AD. So that's one of the that's something you need to remember when you are using this hybrid identity. Right, so the next feature that it provides is the password hash synchronization, or also known as PHS. Just in case you see that in the exam, that's the password hash synchronization. So what password hash sync does is it's a feature that synchronizes the password hash. So instead of this information, you have the hash, password hash, from on-prem AD to Azure AD. So basically, the user will sign in by the same password that they use in the on-prem AD here in the Azure AD. Let's say you have a cloud application that uses Azure AD as identity provider. The user will use the same password that they use in the on-prem AD. So hence it's called password hash synchronization. Now, how does it work actually? Let me just clear the screen here. Does the password hash sync work? So let's draw here. Let's say this is your AD on-prem, and this is your Azure AD Connect. So let's say you've installed this on a separate server. This is your domain controller. So they can communicate each other. So once you install Azure AD Connect, it will then establish connection to your cloud, your Azure AD cloud, to perform the synchronization. So how the password hash synchronization works. So please pay attention to this one because it may be asked in the exam how this feature works. So everything works in the background. So first the password hash sync. So the hash will get synced to your Azure AD. It will be an encrypted communication between those two. And then once sorry about that. So once the Azure AD gets that hash, it decrypts it. So encrypted, let's put here encrypt, and then decrypt. So Azure AD will decrypt that information or that data and will store it on the user information that it have. So let's say there's an attribute for user here like password hash. It will then store that information as an attribute of that user identity. Remember, this user also came from Azure AD. From your on-premise AD as a synced identity. Now it have an additional attribute, which is the password hash, in the Azure AD. So that's the second thing that happens. Now the third what happens next is when the user signs in to an Azure service, the sign-in challenge dialog box generates a hash of the user's password and passes that hash back to Azure. So basically, when a user logs in, let's say a user here, he tries to log in to a web application. If you have seen that, that login screen before, that dialog box that pops up, then ask for your username and password. So when that happens, so Azure then it generates a hash. So when you type your password there, it generates a hash of that password, and then it will compare it to the hash that's on the user account attribute, that was synced from on-premise Azure AD. Now, this hash has to match, including the password as well. So, password, let's say in a string form, it has to match, and so those are the two main things that this login challenge box look into. Now, if that's all correct, then the user will then get access to the resource. And then, as an additional information, you're gonna see that that tick box here to save credentials. So that's actually useful, and it saves the credentials so that the next time the user accesses the Azure resource, the user will not be prompted for login unless you sign out. So the third is login. I'll call this hash comparison. Yes, so that's how the password hash synchronization works in the background. Let's just do a quick recap. So hash syncs to Azure AD. Azure AD will then decrypt it and store it as a password hash attribute in the user identity or user account. And then what happens next is when the user logs in, they will be prompted for the credentials. Then Azure AD will compare the hash and password that the user entered to the one that is stored in the attribute. So what happens here is Azure AD is actually authenticating the user. Yes, so another stuff here, this is not single sign-on. Don't get confused by that. It is called same sign-in because they are still they are different things. So it's not single sign-on. So SSO, not, it's same sign-in because they use the same information, same username, same password to authenticate. Okay, so next one is Pass-Through Authentication, or PTA. Yeah, so that's the abbreviation for that. So pass-through authentication is an alternative to Azure AD password hash synchronization and provides the same benefit of cloud authentication to organization. So if you can't do hash sync, you do pass-through authentication. So PTA allows users to sign in into both on-premise and cloud-based applications using the same user account and password. So it sounds the same as password hash, but the difference is the way it authenticates the user. So I think the best way to explain that is to just illustrate it. So let's say you have your user here, your Azure AD, and then let's say this is your on-prem AD with the AD Connect installed on it. So we all know that these two has been already syncing identities. So what happens with the pass-through authentication is when a user tries to sign in to Azure AD or an application that uses Azure AD as identity provider, Azure AD will then send a signal, or it will actually it will prompt the Azure AD Connect for authentication. So it will then send all the information to Azure to on-prem AD, and will let on-prem AD to do the authentication. So there's no synchronization of password hash or whatsoever. It's basically just passing the information to on-prem AD and letting on-prem AD do the authentication. So as simple as that. The things that so what will make you use pass-through authentication? So pass-through authentication is free, so you don't need additional license for that to use it. Yeah, it can be enabled by just using Azure AD Connect. It uses a lightweight on-prem agent that listens for and responds to password validation requests. So once you enable this pass-through authentication in Azure or in AD Connect, it will install an agent here as the listener for those requests, for the authentication request that your Azure AD will send to your on-prem AD. So because it's agent-based, you can create another, let's say, Azure AD Connect server here with the pass-through authentication agent enabled, and it could serve as a backup. So let's say this server died, you're gonna have a backup server for that. Yeah, so that's pass-through authentication. So you see the difference. Pass-through authentication doesn't sync anything, and password hash syncs the password hash. So that's the main difference between them. Federation integration. Federation is a collection of domains that have established trust. It is an optional part of Azure AD Connect and can be used to configure a hybrid environment using an on-premise AD federation services infrastructure. So since it's optional, I don't think a lot of organizations use this unless there's a special case. So you can federate your on-premise environment with Azure AD and use it for both authorization and authentication. Authorization. Can't spell now. And authentication. I think the main purpose here is to make your on-premise AD as the authentication um, authority. So let's just on-premise here. So on-prem. Just to illustrate how federation integration works, since it's a trust, so it's a collection. Let me just put here. It's a collection of multiple domains. Oh, I can't right now. Multiple domains that have that established trust. Right? So let's say you have your on-premise AD here. And you have your Azure AD. So there's no password synchronization or whatsoever. There's no pass-through authentication that's happening here. So what do they have here is on the trust, right? So trust for authentication and authorization. So let's say you have an internal user here, and that user tries to authenticate. It will go through to the on-premise AD for authorization, for authentication, and it could also go to Azure AD to do the same. But the authentication should always go to your on-premise AD. So if an external user here, let's say, tries to log into a web application, that user can go to Azure AD at the same time to the on-prem AD for authentication. So there's no sync that's going on here. Azure AD doesn't actually, it's not passing through authentication here. So yeah, it's more on a federated environment kind of thing. So let's say you wanna set up high availability on this kind of structure, you set a password hash sync. So on-prem will start syncing password hash on your Azure AD, so that if this fails, you still have Azure AD as a backup on your federation services. Right, so password write-back. So password write-back is a feature enabled with Azure AD Connect that allows password change in the cloud. So password change in the cloud. So it allows users to change the password from cloud, so that means from Azure AD, and then it will be written back to your on-premise AD. This process is real-time and zero delay. So as simple as that, I think that's pretty straightforward. So when a user changes the password in Azure AD, it will then be written back to on-premise AD immediately. Now, the benefits of this are, first, are the enforcement of your on-premise AD policies, so password policies. Because at the time of recording of this video, the Azure AD does not support some of the password policies that are in the on-premise um, on-premise AD. Let's say when a user resets their password, it is checked to ensure it meets your Active Directory Domain Services policy before it gets written to the directory, such as, for example, the history, the password history, complexity, and age, etc. So you could have password filters set in your on-prem AD that will that change password will be checked against those policies. Another benefit here is zero delay. As we said, once it's changed in the cloud, it will be written back immediately and checked against the on-premise policies without delay. So if it doesn't pass the policy, it will notify the user straight away. Like this password does not meet the password policies. It also supports change from the access panel from Microsoft 365. So when you actually, if you log into your Microsoft account, you can change it straight from there. Also, admins can do that from Azure portal. And those are all immediate change, no delay. Another benefit here, it does not require inbound firewall rules. Right, so that's really good. That's why it's very easy to activate within your Azure AD Connect server. So there's no any additional requirements for that. So once you activate it, all the communication will go through port 443. So that's port 443, and it's all outbound. So yeah, that's as simple as it gets. The health monitoring. So health monitoring or Azure AD Connect Health. It's a feature. It's actually in the Azure portal with under Azure AD Connect. It provides robust monitoring and provides a central location in the Azure portal to view the health service status of your Azure AD Connect. You could see there the server health as well, and it installs an agent on the sync server in order for this to work. So what you can do with Azure AD Connect Health is you can monitor and gain insights on your synchronizations. You can set alerts. So let's say something failed, or if the health is degrading, you can send email alerts, and you can set that up. So email alerts. I think another if it's being asked in the exam, another thing that you can do with health monitoring is you could access or gain insight of your identity infrastructure that is used to access Microsoft 365 and other Azure AD applications. So it's more of a robust, auditing function in Azure AD. So Just gonna put here monitor identity infrastructure. Alright, so that's all. That's the features that you could activate or get when using Azure AD Connect to implement hybrid identities. Now, on our next session, we will be configuring these features in our Azure Lab, especially these two, I think the three, because we need this. This is the most important ones, and we'll be configuring password write back. We'll be checking health monitoring, and if it gives us time, let's check on federation integration. So yeah, thank you for watching. See you on the next one.